G'day and welcome to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about rankings, projections, and all the things in between. How much do they actually matter? What are the best rankings for you to actually look at and how to utilize them to win your league? Let's go!
Jordan open. Chicago with the lead. Bryant to shot.
Not a game. We talking about practice.
LeBron James with no regard for human life. Anything's possible.
Back out to Allen. His three-pointer. Bang!
Curry for three. Wow! Unbelievable. Making it rain in New York.
We the North are now we the champions.
Not the destination, it's the journey. Mamba out.
G'day and welcome again to the Ball Boys Fantasy Basketball Podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Casey, and you can find me on Twitter or X at Ball Boys Fantasy. And like we said off the top of the show, guys, today is going to be a show about fantasy basketball rankings. And I'm not going to be revealing my rankings, although you can check that out in probably 2 to 3 weeks now over at ballboysnba.com when you purchase our season guide. It's got all of my rankings and projections on there. But before we do that, before we release that, I'm going to do a show today, and I think it's a very important podcast for you guys who are wanting to take your fantasy game to the next level. Later in the preseason, we're going to talk about busts, sleepers, all these kind of things, mock drafts, all those sort of things. And a lot of those shows, in my experience, get the most amount of views. People want to see all those sort of things, and that's fine. Like it's fun to talk about. But it's shows like this and really understanding the nuances of fantasy basketball, of how rankings and how the team building in fantasy basketball makes the difference between you being a good player versus an average player. And I think that if you're tuning in now early in the preseason, it's a good sign for you to be a step ahead of your league mates. So I think there's a lot of good information for us to go through here, and a lot of things that I think get misrepresented and maybe over-focused on in the community when it comes to the importance of rankings when it comes to drafting your team. And we're going to go into a few different things today. For example, what are rankings and when I think about like a top 50 ranked player, what does that actually mean? When does it apply in terms of how much should I value it when I'm drafting a player? How much should I apply when I'm doing a roto league versus a head-to-head league versus a points league, all those kind of things. So without wasting too much of your time, guys, let's go on straight into it. So if I bring up our first little screen here, so where do rankings apply? Now, I guess the majority of this show, we're going to be talking pretty much about category leagues, because when we talk about rankings for a points league, it's pretty simple. Who scored the most fantasy points per game? They're going to be ranked higher than the guy who scored fewer fantasy points per game. And so when you look at seasons past, you can sort of go, okay, here were the rankings last year. This is the player that scored the most amount of points. This is the player that scored this amount of points. And you just sort them out through that one. Depending on your scoring system, how many points are allocated for rebounds, assists, steals, triple doubles, whatever. As long as you have that system and those customizations up to date with how those points come out, we can very easily do that. And so for ranking, it's not too much nuance when it comes to that. You can talk about projections versus rankings, and we will discuss that a little bit later. But in terms of ranking those players, it's very, very simple. How many points do they score? That's going to be how you rank them. For category leagues, it's a lot different, okay? And this is, again, not to sort of beat the dead horse or anything like that, but this is, I guess, sometimes the reason I prefer category leagues is because there's a lot of nuance and a lot of different ways you can go about them. And even when you talk about how much a player is worth, there is a lot of debate. Even though we have these rankings that we can refer to, sometimes they don't always tell the truth. So in category leagues, both in roto and head-to-head leagues, these rankings that you see can be very different depending on what it is you're talking about. So what are rankings, and how, for category leagues, how do we come up with them? So how were they created? So basically, a ranking system, or how they're used in Yahoo and other sites, places like Basketball Monster, all these other places that rank their players, how are they created? So basically, from my understanding, the way that they're created is that they are a sum of all the Z-scores for each of the categories. Now, again, for most sites, we're going to refer back to the standard 9 categories. So that's points, rebounds, assists, steals, blocks, turnovers, free throw percentage, field goal percentage, and threes made. Went completely out of order on that one for some reason. But those 9 categories, and when you rank them, you're taking your Z-score of each of those categories and adding them all up together. Okay, so nothing is weighted higher than the other. They're all weighted the same. It's just your Z-score in each of those categories all added together. Now, you might be asking, what the hell is a Z-score? Now, this is where it all gets a little bit more mathematical and technical, but a Z-score is basically, I'll read out a little description here, a little definition. It's a measurement that describes the value's relationship to the average of a group of values based on the standard deviation of that data. Now, what that basically means is that if there's an average amongst a group of players, let's say the top 250 points, and I've actually got this data here in front of me as well. If the average amounts of points scored between the top 250 fantasy basketball players is 13.8, and the standard deviation, so the average difference for those ones in between, is 6.6. So if you're a player that scores, let's do some quick maths, about 23 points per game, then actually I'll completely butcher this. If you're a player that scores just over 20 points per game, you're close to around 1 standard deviation away from the average, which gives you a Z-score of about 1. Okay, so for that category, you're giving a score of 1. Versus if you have a rebound stat, okay, so if you're averaging in rebounds is about 5, and the standard deviation is a little bit more than that, although I think I've just jumbled up all my stats here. So if the average is about 5, the standard deviation is about, I don't know what's happened to I had these saved here before, but they've gone wonky on me. I think the average and the standard deviation is about 2.3, 2.4 for rebounds. So if you've got someone who's averaging, 8 rebounds a game, you're going to get a Z-score of 1. So 8 rebounds is equivalent to 21 points. So that you can have the categories kind of even on an even playing field, so that one's not worth more than the other. So it can get very confusing, I guess, when you're talking about standard deviations, Z-scores, and things like that. But that's basically how fantasy sites weight all of their categories the same, so that one category is not more important than another category. And the reason they do that is because it is something that is primarily used in 9 category leagues. And this is how you would get your ranking. So if you add all those sort of things up together, then you're going to get a score. And then basically of all the players listed, they're going to average and sort of put all these players' scores in a row. And the highest score is going to be the number 1 ranked player. The lowest score is going to be the lowest ranked player. So again, though, it is important to understand that the ranking and then the value that the player gives you are 2 different things. So, for example, a really excellent website to do this on is Basketball Monster. We're going to go over to Basketball Monster now, and if you're watching over on YouTube, you can have a good understanding of this one, because I think this is important to kind of get an idea of what rankings mean and what values actually mean as well. So, if we look over on Basketball Monster, we look at the players' ranks. So Nikola Jokic, this is last year's data, by the way. Nikola Jokic was the number ranked player, but in terms of his value, he was a 0.85. Now, ignore that number. For example, it's not super clear exactly what that number means, but in terms of when you've added up all the Z-scores of these categories here, you've come to this number, and that's what their rank is. Joel Embiid is 0.83, Shea is 0.75. So you can already see that, but the difference between Embiid and Jokic is very similar. There's actually not too much difference, 0.2 of a difference. But then the difference between Embiid and Shea is 0.8. So the gap between these 2 players is smaller than the gap between these 2 players, Embiid and Shea, that is. So even though one's ranked, they're only 1 rank apart, the value of each of those players is actually different in terms of where they stand. So you can have, and again, if we go further down the list here, you can have, if we look from 64 all the way down to 71 here, they're 8 ranks different, but in terms of their value compared to the rest of the group, it is actually identical, or at least to 2 decimal places identical. So these people here, in terms of their ranking, it really isn't much separating them between 8 different ranking spots. In fact, it's infinitesimally small. Like, you can't even tell on this graph, because obviously it goes to 2 decimal places, the difference. So the rankings here will sort of put them in an order, but it probably is more important to understand at least the value of each player when you've added up all of these scores and what is contributing to the player. So again, this is not sponsored by Basketball Monster or Josh Lloyd over at Locked On Fantasy Basketball, but it is one of the better visualizations of figuring out what this all means. So on a website like this, you don't have to sign up or anything. This is just the free tools or anything that anyone can use. You can jump on here and see Nikola Jokic. A lot of his points came from, a lot of his value came from points, rebounds, assists, and field goal percentage. He was averaging about steals, blocks, and free throw percentage. His threes were slightly poorer, and his turnovers were bad because he turned the ball over a lot. So all of those sort of things contribute to make one thing. So when you see some of these guys, sometimes you'll see, for a lot of players, there's something that's particularly larger than all the rest. For example, like Jaren Jackson Jr. here. He's got average across the board, slightly, below average in assists, but then an extremely high one category here, which is blocks, which boosts his value. So that's contributing a lot to his value compared to the rest of his other stats, whereas a few of these other guys have a few more greens there, maybe not quite as dark a green because they're not as far and away the best in the category. But again, it's sort of just important to understand how people come to that value, I think, when you're talking about, evaluating a player's impact to your fantasy team. So that is what rankings are. If you are a little bit more confused, make sure drop it into the comments and we can try to explain this as best as I can. I probably butchered that as we've gone along, but I think as long as you understand that the rankings, the number in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4 is probably less important at this stage, especially when talking category leagues, than what or the value that they're bringing to your team is. I think we're on the right track. So let's go back over to this one here. So the next thing I want to have a talk about here when we're talking about rankings is, what does ranking mean in different formats, and how can I best use a ranking number to help me in my drafts depending on what format I'm using. So again, we'll go back to the point scoring system. It's very easy. You're talking about projected fantasy points. So again, you can very easily do that. Write out a list of what you think a player is going to average. If you have how many points that is associated to it, then you can sort of add that all up together, and it's going to give you a projected fantasy score. Pretty simple. Now, Roto Leagues. This is where I think that in Roto Leagues, that 9 category ranking. So if you go onto a Yahoo website, or even if if we were back on basketballmonster.com, the 9 category ranking is basically the standard ranking systems that we use. So when often people are referring to, he was a top 50 player, we're talking about the 9 category rankings. And that's when you take all of those categories and they're weighted the same. Now, the reason I think this is the best way to use this ranking system in a Roto League is because when you're in a Roto League, you're using, you're trying to compete in all the categories, right? You're getting 12 points if you're in a 12-team league. You're getting 12 points if you win that category. You're getting 1 point if you lose that category. So you're trying to get the most amount of scoring possible. And to do that, it's probably best to do it over all of the categories. So every category in that format is weighted and worth the same as another category. So that's where the 9 category ranking system, I think, is at its best. So if you're in a Roto format and you're competing in that format, whether it be 8 category or 9 category, if you involve turnovers or not, those rankings, I think, are the most useful when doing that. Because, like we said, the value of each category is the same because they all correspond to an equal amount of points. To a point. We'll talk about punting later on. In head-to-head leagues, though, I think that things can be a little bit different. So when we're talking about head-to-head leagues, we often talk about, and I will go into much more depth about punting in a future video and a future podcast series as well. But when we talk about punting, this is where things get very confusing and where rankings, I think, really let us down. Now, if we just talk about last year, I'm going to give you guys an example. So in the 9 category ranking system, so like when we're talking about with Roto Leagues, Giannis was ranked the 104th ranked player last year in 9 cats versus Delon Wright, who was ranked the 59th ranked player. Now, if I just have a look at those stats here, so Giannis averaged 28.4 points, 0.8 threes, 11.8 rebounds, 6.1 assists, 0.9 steals, and 0.8 blocks. He did it on 56% field goal percentage, 64% free throw percentage, and 3.6 turnovers. Now, compared that to Delon Wright, if I just find him here. Oh, it's a lot of names. I'm just going to search him up real quick. Should have this prepared. But Delon Wright averaged, very slow here on the internet over in Brisbane. I really should have had this prepared. Okay, so Delon Wright averaged 6.1 points. Sorry, no, he didn't. He averaged 7.4 points, 0.8 threes, 3.6 rebounds, 3.9 assists, 1.8 steals, 0.3 blocks, 47 from the field, 87 from the free throw line, and 0.9 turnovers. So if you compare those two stats, Giannis averaged more points, rebounds, assists, blocks, and field goal percentage. So he was better in 5 categories. Delon averaged more steals, better free throw percentage, and fewer turnovers. The threes were identical, so we're just going to call that a wash, okay? So if you were to compare these two, one's ranked 59th, one's ranked 104th, but the player who's ranked 104th is better in 5 categories. The player who's better ranked at 59th is better in 3 categories, and they're tied in 1. So in a head-to-head league, Giannis is more valuable than Delon Wright, because if you just had those 2 players on your team, and that was it, you had no other players, then the player with Giannis would beat the player with Delon Wright. So the ranking system, when it's ranked one higher than the other, has let us down there because the most valuable player was actually the player who was ranked lower. Now, this is because when you're talking about a head-to-head league, not all categories are created equal in terms of when you're going up against someone, all you have to do is beat them in 5 categories to get the win and move on, especially when you're talking about the playoffs. So in the playoffs, you beat them, you move on to the next round. That's all you need to do. So if you're already bad at a certain category, there's less and less value in you trying to save that category and get it higher, because you're not going to get more points like in a roto league if you're going to be second last or third last, where you're going to get a few more points in that kind of scenario. In a head-to-head league, it's about building strengths and having a solid foundation of a team so you can go out and beat another team 5-4, 6-3, or whatever. So that's where the ranking system, when we're valuing all 9 categories or all 8 categories, lets us down. So what is the best way for us to value players in a head-to-head league? Now, in my opinion, this is by no means foolproof, and it definitely changes once you draft the team, depending on the league size and all those sort of things. So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all, but in my opinion, when you're going to look across a league and just value a players, I think that the best way to do it is by using what we call a -1 ranking. Now, if you guys have listened to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball podcast with Josh Lloyd, he's talked about a lot this offseason. I've talked about it before in previous years. I've also sometimes referred to it as a punt ranking, but when I talk about a punt ranking, sometimes I think that can also be misleading, and I'll explain why. Because when you're punting, so again, if we bring back the example of if we go back over to Basketball Monster, if we talk about punting, if I go and punt free throw percentage, so right there before, Giannis was the 104th ranked player. If I turn on the punt free throw percentage, just kicks me out. If I go into punt the free throw percentage, Giannis is now the 10th ranked player. Okay, so he shot up 94 spots. But if I'm punting free throw percentage, players who have good free throw percentage, their value is less. Now, not everyone in your league is going to be punting free throw percentage, which means that Giannis's value on your team, because you are punting free throw percentage, will be different to another team that is not punting free throw percentage. So therefore, it creates a little bit of a gap. So this does not mean that because I'm punting free throw percentage that I should be drafting Giannis at 10 because he's the 10th best player. Because if you look ahead, you've got a player like Nicholas Claxton, who's the 5th ranked player when you punt free throw percentage. So should I be drafting Nicholas Claxton at 5? No, that is not what we should be doing. What we should be doing is using -1 value. Now, when we use -1 value, what that does is it takes out every player's worst category and ranks it that way. So when we do a -1 ranking, instead of just taking out free throw percentage from everyone, it picks and chooses every single player's worst category. So, for example, if I look up a few things here, Claxton, it's free throw percentage, but for someone like Jaren Jackson Jr., it's assists. So, when evaluating Jaren Jackson, it'll take out assists, but count all of his other categories. And it will do this for every single player and give us a list of those players. And I think that when we look at from a draft point of view, this is the best way to value players in a head-to-head league, because depending on every team's different punt, this will be kind of where teams are looking to value their players. For example, it's kind of hard sometimes to go into a draft and have a pre-plan, I'm going to punt this category, because you don't know who's going to be there, especially if you're towards the end of the first round. You don't know who's going to be there, who's going to fall to you. So you might be going, oh yeah, I'm going to punt free throw percentage, but maybe Giannis gets picked before you and Luka goes before you, and you're going, oh, well shit, the next best player is Claxton. I think that's a big mistake by drafting him at that point, because the whole point of punting is about creating value. So how do we determine what punt strategy is the best per position where you're drafting, or for what player you're grabbing, and then when should I draft those players? So for example, when you're using the -1 value, it sort of creates a good list and a good ranking of players where in their most ideal punt, where would a player rank when everyone else has got the same kind of treatment? And I think that is the best way. It's not perfect. It's probably used more for the early parts of the draft when you're trying to get those, cornerstones of your team. But I think that's the best way to value a player, and can also be a good way to value a player when looking at a trade. Okay, so for example, if I'm trying to trade a Nicholas Claxton and I'm in a team and I've got punt free throws, like there's no way any other team's going to give me a top 10 player for Nicholas Claxton, but he's a top 10 player in my build. But if I look at like a -1 ranking, for example, that might give me a better understanding of what his value is across the league. Because, yeah, for other teams, he's definitely not going to be sitting there at number 5. So I think if that is the best way to at least use a ranking, a one-stop shop number for players in a category league. But remember, when you take into account punting and all those kind of things, you don't get extra points for being twice as good as the next player. You don't get, if you're blocking 40 shots that week and your opponent's blocking 20, you don't get 2 points for that. You still only get 1. So remember, when you're doing punting and the ranking skew sort of things, and all these centers fly up the draft board in terms of their rankings, that also is very misleading, because you still want to have a balance in your team. And those rankings can be fine, but it also is always about your team and your team as a whole versus the other teams in your league. So the biggest mistake I see people make when we're talking about punting is that they, maybe they go over and use Basketball Monster and they look at those rankings and they go, oh shit, Nicholas Claxton's at number 5. I'm going to make sure I get him in the second round. And then, oh yeah, Walker Kessler's, at 15. I'm going to get him in the 4th round. And they've got this team which on paper is like ranked so well, but they're just so strong in rebounds, field goal percentage, and blocks and turnovers, and they're really, really good in these 4 categories. But every week they're losing 4-5 because they just don't have the steals or the points or the assists or whatever to compete with those other teams. So I think that is the most important thing to take away, that whilst these rankings might put players above, it's also about making sure that, especially in a category head-to-head league, that your team is balanced compared to the other managers in your league. It's always very hard to sort of talk about this, because it always depends on what other teams in your league are doing. Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? And you need to be beating them, because you're not just versing a computer, you're versing other people and their teams. So it always does change depending on what is happening there. So the last thing that I want to talk about here is rankings versus projections. So a lot of times, and I do this, I'll use rankings and we talk about the season guide. We'll talk about my rankings, and then I've also got my projections. Now, rankings can be used in 2 different ways. You can kind of go through say you're during the season, someone's ranked somewhere. Well, that's kind of where they are during that season right now. A lot of places will talk about rankings as what it means to last year. So stuff that's already happened, this is where they ranked. Other ways that you can use it, if I'm doing a ranking list, it's more of a subjective list. So, for example, in my season guide, I'll have my top 150 rankings, but I'll also have my projections. My projections is just what I expect a player to do, and then formulas and calculations have kind of given a number and sorted them out from 1 through to 250. Whereas a rankings is I've then taken that projection and then based on other things that are harder to quantify and harder to sort of put formulas to, I've moved them around. So things like risk, things like injury, age profile, upside, downside. That's where I've put a bit more of my subjectivity to that list, and that's what I'm calling my rankings, because this is, again, you know, rank your top 5, you know, it's a subjective thing, right? So whereas a projection is very much based on what I'm thinking they're going to do, this is what the data spits out. And I think it's important, again, to remember those two things. Now, again, if you look at a projection list, going off that and picking the number 1, 2, 3, 4, that's also going to lead you to some other issues, because fantasy is not all just about the pure hard numbers. There's also a little bit of that subjectivity into it as well. So combining those two things together, I think is going to lead you guys to having the most success when it comes to fantasy hoops. So hope that all makes sense, guys. It's probably a dry episode, but I think if you can wrap your head around that, the earlier the better, and the more success you are going to have in fantasy basketball, because you can be given all of the tools, all of the best, sites and ranking boards, projections in the world, but if you don't know how to read them and use them on draft day, I think you're always going to be a little bit behind the 8 ball when it comes to versing those who can. So if you can start to get that understanding of how to use those lists, how to use those projections and those numbers, you're going to be on your way to become a better fantasy basketball player. So thank you very much, guys, for all sticking around for that dry episode there. But make sure, if you are enjoying these episodes, give them a big thumbs up over on YouTube. If you can, drop by Apple Podcasts, give it a 5-star rating and review. And we'll see you next time where we're talking punting. Laters.